Welcome to this episode of the Death by Variance video article series. For this episode, we're going to talk about the MTGA shuffler, and we are going to try and demystify it for everyone. I hope. So what exactly do I mean by that? Well, we're going to talk about how the shuffler works. Right? So how does MTGA shuffle a deck? And next we're going to talk about how easy or difficult is this to do. In fact, we're going to show you how you can do this yourself. Not of course with your MTGA client, but that is how easy it is for you to actually make a fair shuffler. Uh, and then the next item is the shuffle truly random? So we're going to address that question that a lot of people typically point out whenever issues about the shuffler come up, and they say, well, that's not really random. What does that mean? What does that mean that it's not truly random? And does it matter? So that's what we're going to talk about in that bullet point. And finally, and more importantly, is this shuffle fair? Or is the shuffler fair? What do we mean by fair? Meaning, is the shuffler not giving you hands, or is the shuffler not providing an unfair advantage to some players versus other players? Right? So that means it's fair if it's not doing that. Alright, so Wizards of the Coast has been very straightforward about what the shuffler or what shuffler they're using for Magic the Gathering Arena. And as stated here by Chris Clay from a post 2 years ago, right? The algorithm that is used to shuffle Magic the Gathering decks is the Fisher-Yates algorithm, and that algorithm is implemented, and the random numbers that are used from this, a Mersenne Twister, which is seeded with 256 cryptographically secured bits. Now, in order to understand this, so there are two parts to this statement, right? What we can do, what we can implement is this, the Fisher-Yates algorithm. And we're going to talk about the other part in a later slide. All right, so the Fisher-Yates algorithm is a shuffling algorithm. Right, so what exactly is Fisher-Yates? So it's a very simple algorithm developed years ago, decades ago, like in the 30s if I'm not mistaken. So this is from Wikipedia. So what is the Fisher-Yates algorithm? So this is the algorithm. So suppose you have a deck of big N cards. So you begin the Fisher-Yates algorithm by writing down numbers from 1 through big N. Next, you pick a random number k between 1 and the number of unstruck numbers remaining. So in this case, so in the first iteration, you just pick a number from 1 to big N. But after that, then you strike out one of the numbers, and so you can now only pick from, for the next iteration, you can now only pick from 1 to big N minus 1. So once you've picked a number the first time, right, once you're here on this step, you pick a number for the first time, then you count from the low end and identify that kth number that you picked. Whatever that number is, you strike it out. So it's removed from the list and then transferred to a separate list, which will be your output. You then go back to step 2. So meaning you now pick a random number between 1 and one of the and the number of unstruck numbers remaining. Since you have struck out one number, now you choose from 1 to big N minus 1. Okay, and then you repeat it again. Whatever number you choose, you locate that number, strike it out, and put it in the separate list. You do this over and over again until all the numbers have been struck out. And so once you've done that, then that means that you now have a fair shuffle. Right? You don't need to do that again. This is now a fair shuffle of that set of cards. So if you draw an opening hand from that, that will be a fair opening hand from that deck of cards. random number, let's say by throwing an 8-sided die, and then you get 3. Okay? So now that you have 3, you scratch 3 out, and then that becomes the first number in your new list. Then you do it again, and then you roll, let's say you roll a 4. Alright? So you roll a 4. So what does that mean? You strike out the fourth element, right? This time that fourth element is 5. So note that 3 is no longer there, right? So you should be counting 1, 2, 3, 4, which happens to be 5. So now you put that into your result, right? And next, now you go to the next one. So now, let's say you roll a 5. You roll a 5, so you start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is 7. So you scratch out 7, and that becomes your next number here. And so on and so forth until you run out of numbers. Once you've run out of numbers, well, then you have your permutation. Okay, and this ordering is now a fair shuffle. It is a fair shuffle of those 8 cards. Okay? It is a fair shuffle in the sense that this particular ordering is has an equal chance of happening as any other different ordering of the same 8 cards. Okay? Alright, so now let's do the modern method. So the modern method is another way of doing the Fisher-Yates shuffle developed by Durstenfeld. It is not exactly the Fisher-Yates shuffle that we see on this side, but it's a more efficient version of this shuffle. So how does it work? So we again have it as an example here where we have 8 cards. And what you do is you again, on the first step, roll for a random number from 1 to 8. So let's say you roll the 6. Right? So you roll the 6, but what you do is you swap the 6th element with the last element. So you swap the 6th element of the list with the last element. In this case, those are 6 and 8 respectively. So you just swap the positions of 6 and 8, as you can see there. Okay? And the one that gets pushed to the last position, 6, is locked there in place. So that is now your one of the resulting permutations that you're going to have. So next, now, you can now choose a number from 1 to 7. So you now do not need to choose a number, excuse me, you now do not need to choose a number from among the unstruck numbers. So you don't need to take note of what those unstruck numbers are, which is good. I mean, that's where the added efficiency of this algorithm comes in. So let's say you choose 2, right? So what happens is you now exchange the second element with the last element. The last element now is still 7 and the second element is still 2. So you just swap these two, right? So in the previous list, this 7 was here, right? The 7 was here, so you can see here. So you just swap that with 2, and that's why you see the swap there. So you can see the rest of the algorithm play out here. So now you can choose from 1 to 6. So let's say you chose 6. So this is the first time where the number is not the same as the roll, that's the index. So the 6th element is 8, right? If you look here, what is the 6th element here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 8. So you're going to exchange the number 8 with itself because it's also at the last of the list from 1 to 6, right? So these are the numbers that were remaining. So therefore, nothing happens, and 8 just gets moved into the result here. So it's like you swapped it with itself, and then you lock it in place. Next, so you have 1 to 5. So let's say you have 1. So you have to exchange 1 with the last number, which is 5. So that's why now 1 is here, 5 is there, right? Because you swapped these two. Next, so you now can only choose from 1 to 4, and let's say you chose 3. So that means, so this is 3, right? This is 3, so you swap it with 4. So 3 goes here and 4 goes there, right? Okay, so next, you now can only choose from 1 to 3. Let's say you chose 3. So that means that you're going to swap 4 with itself because it's at the end and it's the third element. So it just moves there to the result. And finally, you only have 1 to 2 and you chose 1. And so you are going to swap these two. So that means 5 goes here and 7 goes there. And you can't do anything more. So this becomes your result. All right, so again, this result is a fair shuffle. That result is a fair shuffle. All right, so how easy or difficult is this entire thing that we described here in an algorithm? How easy or difficult is it to implement? Well, actually, it's quite easy to implement. Here is a sample implementation done via R, or R, where R is a programming language. You don't need to do it in R. You can do it in any other programming language. You can do it in C, Python. All right, so let me explain this a bit here. So these are just placeholders that tell me how many lands I want, because I want to take note of the land and the non-land cards in the deck, as well as the individual cards in the deck. So I'm stating that I want 24 lands and then 60 minus 24 non-lands. So that's what it does. Next, so this part, I'm just creating, this is not part of the algorithm. This is not part of the algorithm. That is just some vectors that I'm creating so that I can compile the results of the algorithm later on. What this does is it creates a vector of 7 zeros. Right, so it creates a vector 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it creates that vector here and then another one there and places them on those containers. So this part also not part of the algorithm. This is just a loop. So I'm going to skip that for now. And the algorithm, the actual algorithm is this, right? That's the actual algorithm. So let's explain how it works. So first, I put the deck, I put the cards that I want in the deck. All right, so here are the lands and non-land spells. So this creates a vector where I have my non-land spells first. Sorry, my lands first, not non-land spells. My lands first, and then my spells. So it creates a vector like this. 1, 1, 1. So 24 of these ones, right? So there are 24 lands in my example. And then 0, 0, 0, 0, dot, 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 0. So this is the vector that it creates. Okay? Next, I will now add another row here. So this second line adds another row where I just write the numbers from 1 to 60. So these numbers from 1 to 60 represent the individual cards. So numbers 1 to 24 represent the individual cards that are lands. Right? So here we can only say that they are lands, but over here we can actually specify what specific cards they are. So for simplicity, I'm just using numbers to represent the cards. Okay, but you can easily change this to actual names of cards if you like. Okay, all right. So now that we have that, so this is the representation of our deck. These two rows is the representation of our deck. Okay, the first row shows you the land and non-lands, and then the second row just gives you the individual cards. All right, so what we do here is as follows. So we're going to use the modern Fisher-Yates. So we're going to implement a loop for every I, or for every element from the length of the deck. So meaning from 60 to 1. So this is from 60, from the number 60 to the number 1. All right? Okay. So first, we pick a number, okay, a random number. So we pick a random number from 1 to 60. Right? So this is from 1 to 60 because it's from 1 to I, and I is 60 in the first iteration. All right. So now that we've picked a number from 1 to 60, we select the column representing that pick. Right? So we select the column representing that pick, and then we put it on hold. Okay, so we just keep it. Next, we then take the 60th or the last column, so I here 60 in the first iteration, and then we swap it for the part of the deck where we did the pick, right? So it's similar to what you saw in the previous algorithm. We're swapping those two together, or rather, we're not yet swapping here. I'm just putting the last column in place of the picked column. So the picked column disappears from the deck. However, I did place that picked column on hold. So the last step is to put back the picked column into the last column. So to overwrite the last column with the picked column. And this completes one cycle of the algorithm. So, but you need to do it for the rest. So after that, you go back, and now I is no longer 60, it is now 59. Right? Because it reduces from 60 to 1. And so you go to the next step again, you pick from, so you pick a random number from 1 to 59, you get that pick, you locate the column for that pick, you put that column on hold while you replace it with the last column, and then you replace the last column with the one on hold. Over and over again until you finish from 1 to 59. At the end of that, sorry, from 1 to 6, from 60 to 1. At the end of that, you will have a randomized deck. So finally, after that, I do this, which is I draw the opening hand. So this draws the opening hand of your randomized deck. Alright, so now let's have a demonstration of how this algorithm works. And so like I said, this is the actual part of the algorithm that, or this is the actual Fisher-Yates algorithm. The rest are just stuff I add on to initialize. So we're going to run these. So now I have those numbers as my lands and non-lands. Now let's create the deck. This creates the deck. Okay. So now we can look at what the deck is. So here is the deck. 60. Yeah, okay, so here's the deck. So as you can see here, the first row, actually, well, it's a very long row. I mean, it gets cut to this next line. So basically these numbers, as you see here, are your lands, and at some point they become the non-lands, or the spells. All right. So these are the first. So as you can see, the initial order of our deck is that all the lands are at the top, right? All these lands are at the top of the deck, and then the rest, the spells, are at the bottom of the deck. Right? And then these numbers represent the actual cards. So these would take the place of, let's say, swamp, pathway, pathway. Let's say it's a Sultai ramp deck, so that it will have lots of different lands here. Oh, but if that's the case, then it should be an 80 card deck, right? Okay, so let's just stick to 60 cards. All right. So a Scald's deck. That also runs a lot of pathways. All right, so that is our deck right now. Okay, so it's arranged such that all the lands are in front, at the top of the deck. All the spells are at the bottom of the deck. So now we run the Fisher-Yates, the modern Fisher-Yates algorithm. You run that. Oop. Oh, wait, I need to initialize my library. So this is the library that's choosing the random number. Alright, so let's run this. Alright, so that's it. We've run it. And now if you look at the deck, now, so you can see, it's no longer all the lands on the top. So now you have land, land, spell, 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 land, 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 land. And then these are the actual numbers. As you can see, each of the lands should have numbers from 1 to 24 because those are the tags of those lands. And that's true. Alright, so this was the 24th land that you had in the deck. This is the 21st land that you had in the deck, or in that tag rather. And then these are the other lands, and you can see that they also have numbers that are less than 24, less than or equal to 24. So this is one randomization of your deck. Okay, this is one randomization of your deck. Now we can go back to the initialization and then rerun it. So meaning from here to here, if you want to start from the very beginning, we can also start here and just shuffle this. If I run this again, what's going to happen is I just shuffle this ordering again. So if I run that, so now you have a different ordering. So now you have land, non-land, land, and so on. Right? But this is from the initial shuffle that, or it's from the previous shuffle. If you want to start with the initial shuffle, it doesn't really matter. But if you want to start with the initial shuffle, you include these two lines. Okay. So there you have another shuffle. Now, how do we know how this shuffle looks like when we do a lot of shuffles? Well, first, let's look at the opening hand. So this is the opening hand. So it takes the first numbers of the first part of the shuffle from 1 to 7, and that becomes your opening hand. So if I run this, I can look at the opening hand for that particular deck. So you will get this opening hand. All right, so if you do another shuffle, let's do another shuffle, meaning this, if you run that, and then we take the opening hand, so now you have a different opening hand here, where you have 2 lands, 5 spells, whereas here you have 4 lands, 3 spells in our first opening hand. All right, so the question is, how does this look when you shuffle, or when your system has thousands upon tens, or maybe tens of thousands of shuffles being done in very short periods of time? Like at any given point in time, how many people are playing Magic the Gathering Arena? Each of those players are being subjected to the shuffler. Right? Each of those players, whenever they play at the beginning, they're subjected to the shuffler. So how many shuffles are those? Probably tens of thousands, with a long enough time frame, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. I think they did say that they reached their millionth game, right, at some point. All right, so definitely so many shuffles have been done. Right, so now let's look at what the distribution of these shuffles are going to be when we do it that many times. So that's what these are for. I'm going to compile shuffles from 10,000 times. So we're going to do this algorithm 10,000 times. It's not going to take long. So we're just going to run all of this now. That's a different shuffle. I was going to include that, but decided not to. The sorting shuffle is much simpler to implement. You just sort the cards, and then you just take random. You just use random numbers, generate random numbers for each of the card, then sort the cards according to those random numbers. That also gives you a fair shuffle, but it's less efficient than the Fisher-Yates. All right, so. Yeah, so let's do this. Let's run all of it. It's going to take just a bit of time because it's doing it 10,000 times, right? But now it's done, right? So we have done it 10,000 times, and all our data are in these 2 containers. these two containers, open hand compile and I open hand compile. So open hand compile, let me show you what's in there. Let's only look at a few rows so it won't overwhelm our screen. Alright, so these are the opening hands corresponding to lands and non-lands. Alright, so here we have 2 lands, here you got 3 lands, here you got 1 land, probably want to mulligan that. Here you got 2 lands, and so on and so forth. Now if we want to look at the corresponding actual card indices, so we go I compile. So that shows you the card, so I can have them separately. Alright, so I can have them separately. Okay, so let's look at the distribution. So if I look at the distribution of the number of lands in my opening hand, right? So that's, let's say, table and open hand comp. No, not open hand comp. So I took note of the number of lands and land open, right? So I forgot to show you that. And land open already counts the number of lands in the opening hand. So these are the number of lands in the opening hand. What do you notice? You notice some zeros, right? And you notice that they're not appearing so rarely if you're looking at the entirety of it, right? If you're looking at the entirety of this, then you can see that there are, if you consider that all of these 10,000 numbers are from 10,000 players who played the game in the same time frame. They all got shuffled they all got a shuffle from the shuffler within the same, say, 5-minute time frame. So in that case, this player would have gotten a 0 land hand, and then this player would have gotten a 1 land hand. Right? Now, let's change it a bit. Let's say that you have, instead of 10,000 people, you have only 5,000 people. And this represents, each of these consecutive 2 numbers represent their consecutive shuffles, the 2 consecutive games. And so this guy, unfortunately, would have had no lands in 2 shuffles. So what I'm trying to point out here is that these occurrences, these situations, these events, while rare, do happen. And that explains why sometimes a lot of people get very mad. But that's just because they ended up here, completely at random. All right? Okay, so let's look at the distribution of this number of lands. And land open, and then table. All right, so here we have the distribution. So there are 214 out of 10,000 that were 0 land hands. There were 15 that were 7 land hands. That makes sense, right? Because there are a lot more spells than lands in our deck. We only have 24 lands and the rest are spells. But the majority of the bulk of the distribution falls between 2 to 4 lands. Falls between 2 to 4 lands. How does that look in a chart? There we go. All right, so here you can see the distribution, and this actually does look like what we expect. A hypergeometric distribution based on the number of lands that are in the deck. So this does not deviate. It doesn't look like it deviates from what we expect the distribution to be. How about the distribution of the individual cards? That is, how likely is it for each of the individual cards from 1 to 60 to appear in your opening hand? Now, if it is sufficiently random, then each card should have an equal chance. We're assuming that each card in your deck is unique. Okay, so we're not factoring that some of them have 4 copies. Of course, those that have 4 copies should appear more often, right? But let's just, for example, say that you are playing an EDH deck with 60 cards, so a brawl deck with 60 cards where all the lands are unique, all right? So that it will fit that situation. Okay, so in that case, each card in your deck has an equal chance of ending up in your opening hand. So let's look at the distribution of uh, those cards. So to tabulate, we want to tabulate open hand compile I. Right, so these are the frequencies of all of those cards, and as you can see, they're all about a thousand. Their appearance in your opening hand is all about 1,160. Right, so these are from the opening hand. Now let's see the actual distribution. Not 1,160, but about 1,000. So now let's see the actual distribution. Oh. So plot this, bar plot. Okay, so as you can see here, it does look pretty uniform. Right? Of course, you won't get it perfect. Right? They won't all be exactly the same, but they're almost exactly the same. And if you increase the number of iterations, if you increase the number of replicates from 10,000 to 100,000, then it's going to be more and more apparent that this actually levels off and becomes more and more uniform, because yeah, you will see that the true probabilities of each of these appearing in your opening hand is going to be the same. Okay, so this shows that the Fisher-Yates shuffle is a fair shuffle. Okay, it's a fair way of shuffling your deck. All right, so now let's talk about the other issue. Is the shuffle truly random? Is the shuffler truly random? And we go back to the statement by Chris Clay 2 years ago that they use Fisher-Yates, so we have that figured out already. And the Fisher-Yates pulls numbers from a Mersenne twister, which is seeded with 256 cryptographically secured randomized bits. All right, so in order to see how this compares to what we did, right? How this compares to what we did, that is seen here when we do this line. This entire Mersenne twister seeding 256 cryptographically secured bits. In our case, we don't have that. We don't have a Mersenne twister. We don't have cryptographically secure bits. But in my example, I just have this. So I pick I let the software pick a random number from 1 to I. So that's the equivalent of that. So when we say that something is not truly random because it's being shuffled by a computer, it's because at the end of the process, or rather, sorry, at the beginning of the process, the computer needs to make a deterministic selection. So that deterministic selection is called a seed. Okay? So when the computer makes that selection, then that becomes the basis of the randomization. Needless to say, if you know the seed of a specific randomization, then if you apply that seed again, you will get the same result from the randomization. Okay, so in our case, I'm just using my computer and it's probably taking the seed from somewhere, such as my computer clock. That's a typical way of getting a seed. So that means that whenever I run this randomization, it looks into my computer clock, considers the time there, and then uses that as the seed to give me my random number. Now I can force it to select a seed I want instead of the clock. So I can use that by using the function setSeed. So let's say I use set seed 1. So if I use set seed 1 and then run this, then I will get an opening hand, right? I will get some opening hand. Let's say this, number 1 opening hand. Now, if I set the seed as 1 again, and then I rerun it, I will get the exact same opening hand. Okay? Now, in the case of computer shufflers, right? So they cannot use your computer clock, obviously. So they're not supposed to use your computer clock, because then you yourself can alter your computer clock and find out what shuffle you get from a deck with each time in your computer clock. Right? So instead, they use this. They use a Mercian Twister seeded with 256 cryptographically secure randomized bits. You can Google Mercian Twister. I'm not going to go into random number generation, but you can Google that and read more about it. But basically, these are done in-house. So they're doing this on their end, and they're securing it in order to make sure that nobody gets a hold of what or how the seeds are being selected, right? So, or what sequence the seeds are being selected in. So it is actually possible to construct a system that actually does give truly random numbers. So that can be done, and that is actually like being able to do that efficiently is one of the open problems in computer science. But it's not necessary to do that for a shuffler. In fact, pseudorandom numbers are being used for applications that are far more sensitive and are far more valuable than a shuffler in a game. So the argument that these numbers are not truly random is an irrelevant argument in as far as the fairness. It's also an irrelevant argument in as far as the fairness of the shuffler is concerned, and in as far as whether or not the shuffler uh, does give a fair shuffle that is according to what we expect if we have uh, physical cards that are being shuffled fairly. So in those two situations, yes, the Fisher-Yates algorithm will provide you with a fair shuffle that should not differ from how you're shuffling in paper if you are shuffling very, very well. That is, the Fisher-Yates algorithm presents you with uh, a much better shuffle than you could do physically in terms of what the outcome would be if you had a computer shuffle your deck physically. Right? Alright, so is the shuffler fair? Like we said, in a word, it is. It's likely as fair a shuffle as you are ever going to experience. It's a shuffle where you will not be worried that your opponent has mana weaved, right? It's a shuffle where you're not worried that when you give when you present your deck to your opponent will shuffle it and make sure that all your spells are on the top of your library to force you to mulligan. Have you seen that before? There's footage of that in YouTube somewhere. And it was actually caught on camera, and the person who was doing that was disqualified, I think. It was a pro game, so you don't have to worry about that. And you don't have to worry about your opponent mass shuffling your deck when you present it to him or her, such that all your near mint rares and mythics are now slightly played because of how your opponent shuffles the deck. Alright, so our takeaways. There is nothing magical about the Magic the Gathering Arena Shuffler. The Fisher-Yates algorithm is a simple algorithm that is very easy to implement. Whether or not the outcome is truly random is a non-issue. It's not something you want to bring up It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't say anything. And to the people who know better, you just look, you know. And finally, perhaps more importantly, the shuffler is not out to get you. It is a fair shuffle. It is a fair shuffler. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you get unlucky, sometimes you get exactly what you need, sometimes your opponent gets exactly what he needs. And it's really just part of the game. So like I always say, in any game of Magic, if both players are equally skilled, then the player who wins is the luckier player. It's that player who draws the card that they need, or it's that player that did not uh, get stifled during the during the first few turns by not drawing into enough lands. That is if neither player makes any mistakes. Now, if the two players are not equally skilled, then it becomes possible for the player who is not the luckier player to win the game because his opponent may be making mistakes. And if he doesn't make any mistakes, then he would play better than his opponent. He would be playing better than his opponent. That might give him opportunities where there would have been none if the opponent was playing without error. And that's where you can try to win at least some of the games where you are not the luckier player. All right, so I hope that this short presentation has demystified the shuffler for you. And I hope that if you were thinking about uh, how the shuffler might be rigged or how the shuffler is out to get you or any stuff like that, that this presentation is sufficient to quell those thoughts and to get you focused back into just trying to be better at the game. All right, so that is it for me today, and I'll see you again next time. So like I always say, in any game of Magic, if both players are equally skilled, then the player who wins is the luckier player. It's that player who draws the card that they need, or it's that player that did not uh, get stifled during the during the first few turns by not drawing into enough lands. That is if neither player makes any mistakes. Now, if the two players are not equally skilled, then it becomes possible for the player who is not the luckier player to win the game because his opponent may be making mistakes. And if he doesn't make any mistakes, then he would play better than his opponent. He would be playing better than his opponent. That might give him opportunities where there would have been none if the opponent was playing without error. And that's where you can try to win at least some of the games where you are not the luckier player. All right, so I hope that this short presentation has demystified the shuffler for you. And I hope that if you were thinking about uh, how the shuffler might be rigged or how the shuffler is out to get you or any stuff like that, that this presentation is sufficient to quell those thoughts and to get you focused back into just trying to be better at the game. All right, so that is it for me today, and I'll see you again next time.